Welcome to Newsday. I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore. The headlines. The date is June the 12th and the venue right here in Singapore. The first ever summit between a North Korean and US leader puts the Lion City at the crossroads of history. As 92-year-old Mahathir Mohamad is sworn in as Malaysia's Prime Minister, the country's youth give their verdict.
He's like the godfather.
He will do whatever it takes to get what he wants.
Yeah. I guess the age doesn't matter too much. I'm just more worried about his track record.
I'm Lebu Tiseko in London, also on the programme. The mountains of abandoned metal and rubber springing up across China as commuters switch to bike-sharing apps. And Eurovision Song Contest fever spreads across the world as this weekend's grand finale approaches, and Asia's getting in on the act later this year.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Well, good morning. It's midnight in London, 7 p.m. in Washington and 7 a.m. here in Singapore, where President Trump will meet Kim Jong-un next month. It will be the first time an American president has met a leader of North Korea. Mr. Trump made the announcement on Twitter, confirming that the summit will take place on June the 12th. The news came just hours after 3 Americans were released by North Korea who arrived back on U.S. soil. Mr. Trump said he hopes the meeting would be a very special moment for world peace. Nick Bryant reports from Washington.
In the middle of the night, before the birds or the president had started tweeting, the plane carrying the freed prisoners touched down on American soil. Detention to a triumphant welcome from Donald Trump. He didn't want to miss this dramatic homecoming, for it offers flesh and blood proof that his unconventional approach to diplomacy is working.
My proudest achievement will be, this is a part of it, but will be when we denuclearize that entire peninsula. This is what people have been waiting for a long time. Nobody thought we could be on this track in terms of speed. So I'm very honored to have helped the three folks.
This was a made-for-television moment, but the White House quickly turned it into cinema. Slow-motion footage, rousing Hollywood-style music. The former reality TV star claimed this must have set the all-time record for ratings at 3 o'clock in the morning. North Korea's state broadcaster didn't show that kind of panache, but these are remarkable pictures nonetheless. Kim Jong-un meeting the new US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Pyongyang. The leader mocked as Little Rocket Man, enjoying a lighter moment with the Americans ahead of his summit with Mr. Trump. Vice President Mike Pence has been talking about US expectations.
The president senses an opening that may result in a historic agreement. What Kim Jong-un has said publicly and in discussions is that he is prepared to negotiate to achieve complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
So the North Korean leader's security team will soon be pacing the streets of Singapore, the venue for the summit. But has enough diplomatic legwork been done to make it a success? So in a week when Donald Trump withdrew from a nuclear deal with Iran, it's full speed ahead with negotiating a new nuclear deal with North Korea. And having alienated his closest European allies, his administration is forging an improbable relationship with one of America's long-standing enemies. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
All right, let's have a look at some of the day's other news now. And Israel has defended its airstrikes against Iranian targets in Syria. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Tehran has crossed a red line. Now, this is Israel's biggest assault since the start of the war there, and it was in response to rocket attacks on Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Iran's president says he does not want new tensions in the Middle East, but the US accuses his country of provoking the escalation. Let's have a listen to what Mr. Netanyahu had to say.
Iran crossed a red line. we responded accordingly. The IDF carried out a large-scale attack against Iranian targets in Syria. Thanks to the proper deployment of our forces, both in the attack and in the defence, the Iranian action failed. No rocket landed in Israeli territory.
Also making news today, a 104-year-old scientist who travelled from Australia to Switzerland to try and get an assisted suicide has died. David Goodall ended his life by taking a lethal injection at a Swiss clinic. He wasn't terminally ill, but he said his quality of life had deteriorated significantly and he wanted to die. Attackers armed with guns and knives have killed an imam at a mosque in South Africa. 3 men went into the building and stabbed the imam and left 2 worshippers critically injured. The men are said to have escaped in a car after setting fire to the mosque. Their motive is still not clear. At least 47 people have died, with hundreds more left homeless after a private dam in Kenya burst in the middle of the night. Rivers of mud and debris flooded nearby homes, sweeping entire villages away. Weeks of heavy rain had put the dam in the northwest of the country under huge pressure. The music streaming service Spotify says it will no longer actively promote songs by the R&B artist R. Kelly. He's been accused of sexual abuse against young women and underage girls. Users will still be able to find his music on the service. R. Kelly denies the allegations and has not been charged. All right, I want to show you these pictures because this dusty, dry, arid expanse used to be a large body of water. This is the Acuelo Lagoon in Chile, just south of the capital, Santiago, or it used to be. That 12 square kilometre lake has completely dried up, something that's never happened before. And the reason? Local experts say that drought conditions are to blame, but also overconsumption of water.
Now, he may be 92 years old, but Mahathir Mohamad is a man in a hurry. The veteran politician has become Malaysia's Prime Minister again after his party's shock election victory 15 years after he stood down. The result ended more than 6 decades of rule by the coalition, which included Mr. Mahathir's former party. We asked the country's youth what they made of him.
He's like the godfather.
He will do whatever it takes to get what he wants.
Still alive.
It really is time for change, and for a lot of us from the younger generation, we want our voice to be heard.
So now is the time for something different. We don't know, it might be bad, it might be good, but most importantly, it will be different.
Didn't manage to rally people who would normally not vote for the opposition coalition to the cause.
He's aware that he's old, he's aware that he's been through a lot, and very little personal agenda, I feel.
Yeah. I think his squad, in the sense that his team is very, very young and is very, very vibrant.
But obviously, change won't be immediate. It's going to take time, but this is the first step toward that direction.
Young Malaysians there on what they think of Mahathir Mohamad. Well, I've been speaking to Ee Soon Oh. He's the former political secretary to ex-Prime Minister Najib Razak about the transition of power.
There was a little bit of hiccup throughout yesterday. First of all, the results of the election, they were delayed for quite a number of hours. And then the swearing in of the new, also former Prime Minister Mahathir, that was also delayed for almost the whole day. But finally, I think by night time, he was formally sworn in as the new Prime Minister. So it was number one, a very peaceful transition, and number two, a very historic one, because Malaysia sort of transitioned from essentially a one-party state to nowadays, I hope it's a dawn of a multi-party democracy.
All right, and as a Malaysian yourself, you're happy about this transition, you say, but how will this fairly disparate coalition, essentially led by their desire to oust Najib Razak, actually work together once governing starts?
Well, this coalition, they have worked together as opposition for a number of years by now. And in fact, the way they reach decision is perhaps what nowadays a lot of Malaysians would like to see how decisions are made, namely by means of reaching consensus, but each holding on to their principle, each party holding on to the principles. This is as opposed to in the former regime, whereby it's UMNO, the leading party, which is essentially making decisions for all the other component parties.
Now, we know that Mahathir has already hinted at it when he was sworn in yesterday, that there will be an investigation to recover some of those misappropriated funds from the state fund 1MDB. This is the scandal that rocked Najib Razak's leadership. So how do you think they will treat Mr. Najib and his high-spending wife?
Well, I think just as Dr. Mahathir suggested, it will be in accordance to the cause of justice, the rule of law, and so on. I think now that Mr. Najib is no longer the Prime Minister, he will no longer enjoy a certain degree of sovereign immunity. I think the domestic investigations into 1MDB will of course proceed, but also there are also investigations from international jurisdictions, United States, Switzerland, and so on. Those will also go full ahead.
And that was Lee Soon-oh there speaking to me earlier. Well, you're watching Newsday on the BBC, still to come on the programme. As Donald Trump welcomes home 3 American prisoners of North Korea and prepares to meet Kim Jong-un in Singapore next month, we assess the mood in South Korea. Today on the BBC, I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore.
And I'm Lebuti Seko in London. Our top stories. US President Donald Trump will meet the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for historic talks in Singapore on June the 12th.
And the veteran politician Mahathir Mohamad has been sworn in as Malaysia's Prime Minister after his party's shock victory in Wednesday's election. Let's take a look now at some of the front pages from around the world, and no big surprise about what leads the front page of the Straits Times, which of course is all about the swearing in of Malaysia's new Prime Minister. The paper focuses on Mahathir Mohamad's promise that his government will be business friendly. And the South China Morning Post has some good news for villagers in Hong Kong's northern New Territories. It says 550 million Hong Kong dollars will be made available to those being forced to leave their homes to make way for new town developments. And finally, the international edition of the New York Times has some cheeky news from Paris. The Palais de Tokyo is hosting a special tour where visitors wear apparently nothing at all but their shoes. It's the first of its kind in France and has proven popular, with about 30,000 people registering interest. And that's it for some of the front pages. Leba, what are some stories sparking discussions online?
Well, Sharanjit, surprise, surprise, it is Donald Trump. Not much unusual there, but this time he may have gone too far. The US president has banned the sale of Iron Brew at his Scottish golf resort in Tunbury because it might stain the clubhouse carpet orange. Now, if you don't know what Iron Brew is, it is a very, very orange drink, very popular in Scotland, even referred to as the other national drink, and the Scots are furious.
Returning now to our top story, and that's of course Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting right here in Singapore on June the 12th for a historic summit. The first time leaders of the United States and North Korea have actually met. Well, our correspondent Stephen McDonnell is in Seoul and spoke to me earlier.
Absolutely, and people in South Korea now, sure, they're welcoming all this nice talk, but how is it going to be worked out? Because I'll give you an example of one of the big hurdles. On the American side, they're calling for complete and verifiable denuclearization. Now, they don't even know how many warheads the North Koreans might have. Imagine there are dozens. Imagine they're buried deep inside mountains. This will take years to, even if the North Koreans agree to it, start to dismantle. Is the Trump administration really going to go ahead and say, we're not going to ease off that sanctions pressure one little bit until you've fully completed that task? I just think that's not going to fly with the North Koreans. They're going to want some sort of a, you know, ease off on the sanctions. We'll start with the denuclearization. And that's just one problem. I mean, there are headaches galore.
That's right,
but at least the talks are going ahead, and that's what people are happy
headaches
about.
galore, and of course, undoubtedly will be a very busy time for us here in the Singapore Bureau when this meeting does take place on June the 12th. But we know that other locations had been considered, Mongolia, even the demilitarized zone on Korea's border. So why Singapore?
Well, I tell you why I always thought Singapore was an excellent choice for them, because imagine Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, they have to sit down and have a meeting. Now, that's okay if it's at the demilitarized zone, but really, the details of what I was just talking about, that has to be worked out by teams from both countries. And you possibly need delegations, representatives also from China, from South Korea. Where are all these people going to go? They've got to be meeting rooms set up. I mean, in Singapore, they can lock down a whole five-star hotel or several five-star hotels and get to the discussions weeks in advance. So when those two leaders arrive, there's something for them to sign, something to agree on, or even if it goes the other way around, they first have their meeting and then they leave it to their delegations to work out the details. You need facilities to do that.
Right.
And I think Singapore's an excellent place and a neutral place for them to do that.
Steve McDonnell in our Sydney studio there. Now, the humble bicycle has been a mainstay of China's city streets for decades, but in the past few months, giant mountains of discarded frames have been cropping up around the country. And that's because the authorities have been impounding thousands upon thousands of rental bikes that they say are clogging the streets. Let's go to our Beijing correspondent, John Sudworth.
It could be mistaken for a field of flowers, but look closer. This is a crop not of plants, but of metal and rubber. Thousands upon thousands of bikes impounded in the city of Wuhan. Bike sharing has taken China by storm. Unlocked with a wave of a phone, they can be hired or off-hired anywhere. But the innovative tech brought with it a frenzy of speculation. Chinese cities have been deluged with bikes, millions of them. Backed with huge investment, dozens of companies have been fighting for market share, resulting in blocked pavements and a random sprinkling of abandoned bikes almost everywhere you look. In some cities, the authorities have had enough. The extraordinary thing is that many of these bikes are brand new, hardly used at all. Forget stock market bubbles and property bubbles, forget the .com bubble. This is one with wheels on. This is China's bike-sharing bubble. Photos of other bike mountains have been popping up online. Here's one in the city of Xiamen. And this is Shanghai. Yes, those really are bikes down there. But the reality is China faces a far bigger transport challenge: traffic congestion, chronic pollution and a growing health crisis. And it's not just bikes that block pavements. The bike companies now plan to use the huge amounts of data they collect to monitor rider behavior and penalize bad parking. And they insist Chinese cities still need them.
The cities are definitely supporting us. Of course, there needs to be a framework to regulate the growth of the industry, but from a general point of view, taking a step back, cities want this kind of commuting method because it reduces pollution, reduces congestion, it puts people back on the bicycles, but it's also our responsibility as the leader in the industry to provide this in a thoughtful and responsible approach.
As the Chinese bike-sharing schemes arrive in more cities around the world, lessons, they say, will have been learned. John Sudworth, BBC News, Beijing.
Now, later this year, Asia is going to get its own singing competition based on the legendary Eurovision Song Contest. It is renowned for producing the best and also some of the bizarre, and it has a following right across the world. Now, this year's final takes place in Portugal on Saturday night, but there is a country in the region that's already been taking part for the last few years. Australia joined in the fun in 2015, and they've just qualified for the final in the past few hours. Well, earlier I spoke to the man who will be announcing the results of their voting on Saturday, Ricardo Gonçalves.
Australia is genuinely Eurovision mad. The host broadcaster SBS has been broadcasting the competition for more than 30 years here in Australia, and originally it was to make a connection with all the migrants that came to Australia from all over the world, especially Europe. Australia is a very multicultural country, but over the past few years it's gained in popularity, and all of Australia is behind the competition, not just the colour and the glamour, but also the music. So that's where the connection comes from, and because the Eurovision Song Contest is all about music, diversity and inclusion, what better way to include not just Europe but the rest of the world by having Australia take part as well.
And what's the Australian entry like?
Well, it's Jessica Mauboy. Her song is called We Got Love. It's a big song about inclusion and sharing love with the world, so it's very topical in this day and age, and she really performed the song quite well this morning, only about two and a half hours ago on the stage in Lisbon, and we're pleased to say that she made it through to the final, which will be broadcast all over the world and here in Australia on Sunday morning on SBS.
So Eurovision has got a history of some quite interesting songs. Why do you think it just still endures? There's this magic about it and people love it.
Yeah, it comes back down to that diversity and inclusion a theme, I think. I mean, there's all this colour, all this spectacle, but also you have some great music behind it. Some artists are remembered forever. And back to that Australian connection too, just because we've been in the competition for the past 3 years officially, we've actually had artists involved over the past decades. Olivia Newton-John was a competitor representing the UK in 1974. We also had an artist called Gina G, who performed for the UK in the mid-90s, and an ex-talent show winner from Australia, Anja Nissen, performed for Denmark just a few years ago.
Okay, so obviously you're backing the Australian entry, but if there's any other countries you think might be in with a chance, who would they be?
Well, I need to say that I do have a Portuguese background. My family migrated to Australia from the Portuguese island of Madeira. I'm not saying that the Portuguese contender should win, because as the Australian Eurovision spokesperson, I think it would be unfair to influence the Australian vote in any way, shape or form. All I'll say is I wish Jessica Mauboy all the very best.
All right, we just want to show you some live pictures that are just coming in at the moment. That is Mike Pence at the podium, the Vice President of the United States. But we are expecting Donald Trump to take to the stage fairly soon. This is a campaign rally ahead of the midterm elections, so they will be talking about some domestic stuff, but we will be watching for any comments on the international things that have been occupying Donald Trump's mind, the North Korea upcoming summit, also any reaction to the Iran situation. I know that, Sharanja, you're likely to be watching this very closely as well with that upcoming visit too.
That's right, Lebo, we are indeed. June the 12th is the date. It's been set for that huge historic meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and it's right here in Singapore, so undoubtedly it'll be a very busy time for our bureau, so continue to watch. We'll bring you all the latest on that. And coming up, though, we've got more stories, because we'll be taking a look at the controversial R&B artist R. Kelly and why he's been scratched from Spotify. Stay tuned for that.
And just before we go, have a look at these pictures. They are of Ecuador's National Police who held a special ceremony to mark the retirement of 61 police dogs who'd all reached dog retirement age of 9 years. Now, most of them will be staying with their human police partners as pets, and the others will go to people and families from around the country to live out their golden years. That's all from us for the moment, but do stay with BBC World News.